But the original big story of the morning was the GOP tax plan and the continuing drama at the CFPB. And so joining us right now to talk about this in a little bit more detail is the executive director of America Rising PAC. At one point, I'm sure you guys saw her a lot on TV. She was the chairwoman of the College Republican National Committee. Alex Smith is joining us. And Alex, thanks for being here. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me, Tyler.
So Alex, first of all, I appreciate you retweeting me. I just saw that on Twitter. I love having young people on because they always end up retweeting me before the interview's even over. You guys are on top of things. But real quick, why don't you give a little brief overview of exactly what America Rising PAC is in case some people are unaware of it?
Of course. So America Rising PAC is the Republican Party's premier opposition research firm. So what we do is we gather information that's publicly available on Democratic candidates in order to present a narrative to voters so they don't have buyer's remorse. Contrary to popular belief, we don't dive in dumpsters or walk around with an eyeglass and a trench coat, but rather we're really just taking the kind of documents, the kind of information that any other citizen could get through public records requests, through looking at property records in a courthouse in order to see really what these Democratic candidates are hiding.
So you're not buying dossiers from Russian agents on the side, I guess.
That's a negative. My life really isn't that glamorous.
Because the Democrats seem to be a big fan of buying Russian dossiers to try and get dirt on the other side. And so, speaking of, opposition, we know that, being a Republican, the opposition is not only the Democratic Party, but in a lot of cases, the media, especially the mainstream media. And there's no doubt that this GOP tax plan, which isn't even really kind of in its final form yet, is already being portrayed as this is a tax cut for the rich. It's trying to raise taxes on the poor. This is a wealth transfer from the poor to the rich. And so how do the Republicans sort of combat this narrative that the media is already kind of jumping on?
Well, I think fortunately for us, the Democrats seem to be a lot less cohesive on this issue than they were on health care. If you'll remember back in the summertime, they were considerably more organized. They had town halls and, some that really got out of control with some paid progressive groups. But with tax reform, I think we're really seeing that there are several red state Democrats who are feeling the pressure to come over to the table and talk with President Trump and the Republicans. I'm talking about senators like Joe Manchin and Heidi Heitkamp and Joe Donnelly. These are all people who have constituents that want to see their representatives, Republican or Democrat, work with the president. And so if they continue sort of this reflexive, knee-jerk, response against the president and the Republicans' agenda, they're going to find some problems back home. So I think in terms of just shaping the narrative that's out there, it's a lot easier to paint a narrative of progress and of compromise and of activity than it was with healthcare, where you had sort of much more dramatic and over-the-top claims that were then exemplified with some of these quasi-violent groups that were out there protesting.
And, one of the other, and I'm glad you brought up the Democrat component, because it doesn't require 60 votes. It's not going to require 60 votes. You can use budget reconciliation. So they're only going to need 50 and then probably the vice president to be on board with this. But one of the things that some Republicans are concerned about is how much this is going to add to the deficit. And, I've talked to Generation Opportunity. I've talked to a couple of their representatives a bunch of times. They're obviously an organization that, focuses on the concern of young people and in some cases conservative young people. And like I said, it was not too long ago that you were running the College Republicans. And that's something where I think there's sort of a generational divide where, we look at this $20 trillion national debt and young people are the ones that are going to be paying for this. And so how, I guess, you have some of the Republicans that are concerned about that. How concerned are you about the potential adding and continue adding to the national debt?
Oh, I'm absolutely concerned. I mean, Generation Opportunity they use a great term, generational theft,
Yeah.
Which has really happened through the last several decades of legislating, where, our representatives have unfortunately sort of thought about the here and now and not so much about what's coming down the line for my generation and for my children and grandchildren's generation. So it's definitely an unnerving thought as we see that number tick up. That being said, I'm really hopeful about the kind of economic growth that this plan will spur. If you'll remember, with President Obama, we were unfortunately kind of stuck in the mud at 2% GDP growth, and it was a huge problem for my generation who was trying to find jobs. A big problem for us is we were looking for bigger wages to pay down that student debt. Already we've seen that growth tick up to 3%, and I'm confident that under this plan that we'll see even bigger returns through the job creation and the kind of economic activity that this will inspire. So, that being said, I am grateful for the fact that we do have representatives who are still debating the final particulars of this plan, who are debt-minded and
Yes.
are debt-conscious, and they are putting in provisions, whether it's sunsetting various provisions of the bill or sort of working things so that it doesn't add to the overall debt. It is appreciated by our generation, even if we do want to see some economic growth in the short term.
No, absolutely. It is sort of this balance too, because we obviously want to grow the economy, but at the same time, you also need to be very concerned about the debt, and it's balancing those two that it's going to be interesting over the next couple of weeks. We are talking with Alex Smith. She is the executive director of America Rising PAC. And Alex, the other big issue, of course, is what's happening with the CFPB, which to me isn't controversial at all, because I've never seen anything more clear cut. And so we had the previous director. He, of course, decided to resign, I guess, like in the midnight, and then try and somehow appoint his successor, who was, I guess, at the time, his deputy director. And the law is pretty clear on this. We had a judge last night pretty much confirm this, that the president is the one that fills the vacancy. And somehow they're trying to argue that the director leaving office isn't a vacancy, it's an absence, and therefore they're the ones that are responsible for it. And I don't even understand where they're coming from. Andrew McCarthy wrote a great piece at the National Review. He's a former prosecutor and made a very easy argument. The president fills the vacancy. This is a vacancy. We had a judge last night say, pretty much that, yeah, that's the case. I don't see this going any further than where it is. How do you see this thing shaping up?
So the reason why there is a controversy over this is because the CFPB for many years now has been operating as an auxiliary office of the Democratic Party and some of its favorite leaders like Elizabeth Warren. They have more money than the DNC, so I think that they turn to them in an effort to really advance their agenda. So we have the CFPB. This is obviously a creation, a Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that was created out of Dodd-Frank after the financial crisis, and all of the reforms that came after it when they were passed by a Democratic Congress. And the CFPB is this really interesting statutory creature where it has very little oversight, and it's not quite independent, but it makes it difficult for the executive branch, under whose authority it operates, to actually remove the head of the CFPB. Additionally, their spending isn't there. There's no congressional oversight of their spending. So of course the Democrats shoving a bill through once again, probably without reading it. They've created this monster, this Frankenstein, where Congress can't look over their spending. The president can't really remove the head of it. And so you've had just sort of this independent creature that's been growing and benefiting Democrats for the last couple of years. A great example is the fact that they lease space, for example, from a prolific Democratic fundraiser's building. I guess they can't use one of the many dozens of federal buildings they have here in D.C. And whether it's a marketing campaign or it's other vendors that have been used. These are all vendors that the Democratic Party often uses. So it's really just been used to benefit their friends. So, and Cordray himself has been no angel. This is the previous director who caused all this drama. He really started running for office in Ohio while he was still the chairman of the CFPB, nearly violating the Hatch Act, which prohibits campaigning using official government resources. So and he's Elizabeth Warren's best friend. This is why she's really so invested in all of this. And what he did was at the 11th hour before he resigned, he appoints a deputy director because it was currently vacant. So that person would assume the chairmanship upon his resignation. Well, President Trump and the Justice Department said, wait a second, this bureau is out of control, okay? We need more oversight here. So we're going to use, not often talked about, the perfectly valid federal law, the Federal Vacancies Act, in order to temporarily fill this agency. And I can't think of any greater leader to really clean up an agency than Mick Mulvaney, someone who is so budget-minded, straight-laced in the way he thinks about things, and so this is where we are. Is that Elizabeth Warren and her Democratic allies, I think, are a little afraid of what Mick Mulvaney is going to find when he starts digging through the receipts at the CFPB.
Oh, yeah. I remember one time they were, I think Janet Yellen was testifying in front of Congress, and they asked her something about the CFPB and the budget, and she had no idea. The CFPB operates in this fourth dimension where they're not accountable. And I actually wanted to ask you about that real quick before we run out of time, Alex, is that, you look at what's happening with Bob Mueller and the special counsel, and you look at this organization, the CFPB, and for some reason, the Democrats are obsessed with creating these agencies, these wings of government that are accountable to nobody and completely removing what our founders, looked at as the check and balance system where everyone's kind of overseeing everyone else. They just continually want to make these organizations and people, funded by the government, but then have no oversight and no accountability to government. And to me, it's amazing to watch this happen, whether it's the CFPB or, like I said, whether it's Bob Mueller, why they continue to do this and think that this is a good idea and this is good for the American people. I have no idea.
Yeah, I think that Republicans have long decried the ever expansion of the administrative state. The fact that the CFPB can exist in this weird limbo, like you described, with very little oversight, is terribly alarming. And I think that this is the kind of message that voters were trying to send in 2016. I bet very few of them actually knew about the kind of abuses of the CFPB, but the American people are smart. They know that this kind of stuff is going on generally in Washington, and this is exactly the kind of message that they were trying to send in 2016, which was clean it up, get rid of it.
And Alex, once again, I appreciate you taking the time joining us here on the program. And once again, Alex is the executive director of America Rising PAC. And Alex, like I said, thanks for being here. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks so much, Tyler.
All right.